Up next on Book TV's Afterwards, the Washington Post's Jason Rezaian discusses the 544 days he spent in an Iranian prison. He's interviewed by Representative Jared Huffman of California. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
Welcome, everyone. I am Congressman Jared Huffman, but today I have the privilege of taking off my hat as a congressman and being a bit of an interviewer and a book reviewer with a great author, Jason Rezaian, who has written this story, Prisoner, about his 544-day ordeal in an Iranian prison. My connection with this author is that while he was living through this hell in Evin prison in Tehran, I was one of many people on the outside working to try to get him released, because I am the congressman for Jason Rezaian and his family in Marin County, California. So welcome, Jason. I can't wait to talk with you about this book.
It's exciting to be here, Congressman. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start by describing the work you were doing as a journalist in Tehran.
Well, in about the late spring of 2009, I made the decision to move to Tehran to focus full-time on being a correspondent there. Starting in 2001, I had traveled to Iran many times. By virtue of the fact that my father was originally from Iran, I had an Iranian citizenship, whether I wanted it or not. And I figured after completing my studies in creative writing and making a go at it as a freelancer for years, not very successfully, because I was pulled away into the family business one too often, it just made a lot of sense during that financial crisis of 2008, 2009 to take a switch of gears in my career and focus on this thing that I was really passionate about. So I started writing from Tehran about politics, but also about culture and about people, stories of the people of this society that we didn't know very well. Mm-hmm. For 30-something years, we'd have a very strained relationship with Tehran, with the Islamic Republic, once it was founded in 1979. And I felt we could do better as news reporters about this country that was so isolated.
You wrote, I went to Iran so you didn't have to.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to give you, as an American reader, a window into this society on the other side of the world, and one that, frankly, as somebody growing up in your congressional district, there was a lot of Iranians around me, not just my own family, but a growing number of people that arrived from different parts of the world after they had left Iran to look for greener pastures abroad. So my thought and my belief was that not only was this country underrepresented in our news media, we had a real responsibility as Iranian Americans or Americans of Iranian origin to do what we could to give a better representation of it in our news media.
So set the stage for us, because one of the things that comes through to me in your book is the incredible roller coaster of events life put you through over a short period of years. You had this terrible year where you lost two very close relatives in pretty short order. Your college mentor, Christopher Hitchens, died. All these lousy things happened to you, but then you began building this amazing life in Iran. You have a young wife. You describe how at one point you and Yegi, who was reporting for Bloomberg, were kind of the main journalistic voice for the United States of America to get news out of Iran. Tell us a little bit about this life you were living right before the ordeal began.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I had a very tough run. When I moved there in 2009, I didn't anticipate so many of the things that would happen in our lives. Often you can't know what's going to happen next. And I think in most lives, there are tumultuous events that change the course of your life. My father and my brother's 5-year-old son died within 4 weeks of each other. Obviously, my nephew was a very healthy young boy and was struck by a fast-moving virus that killed him overnight. You can imagine losing a child has reverberations within the family that now, 8 years later, we still feel very acutely. But for my father, it broke his heart, and he died within a matter of weeks. So that was a very trying experience, and I had to leave Iran, where I had been established and was in a relationship with the woman who would become my wife. But I came home to the Bay Area to help kind of close up loose ends of the family for several months, but all the while knowing that I wanted to return to Iran, that I had started something in my career and with this relationship that I wanted to see through. So
and
when
you really got things on track.
Yeah, I mean, I was in my mid-30s at this point. I'd had enough life experience to know when things were going well for me professionally and when they weren't, and I was really on the rise. And in 2012, I was offered the Washington Post correspondent job, which I jumped at, as anybody would. It was an opportunity to write for the paper of record of the U.S. Capitol. Who could say no to that? And I took it on with a lot of gusto. Yegi at the time was the Bloomberg correspondent, and I think we made up 2/5 of U.S. coverage in Iran. So it was very appropriate that we would kind of join forces, get married. Our home became the Washington Post and the Bloomberg Tehran bureaus simultaneously, and we were building a great life together. We traveled around the region and Europe and East Asia. It was a good place to be situated at that time. And internally within Iran, following the very dark Ahmadinejad years, 2013, there was an election of a president who was, I don't like the monikers of hardline and moderate because it's a theocracy and I don't think those terms make sense. But he was Western-leaning in the sense that he wanted to open relations with the rest of the world. He wanted a less isolationist policy for the Islamic Republic. And whether or not you think that the Islamic Republic should exist or not, the notion that they wanted to connect with the outside world and have better relations with the West, with the United States, integrate their economy, because they understood that that's what they needed to do to placate their people, it was a fascinating story.
And the times were changing in Tehran, right? Describe this. I told you I almost got the feel of it being a Prague Spring in Tehran in the lead up to your arrest, because people were coming and going and reaching out to you about visits to Iran.
Yeah.
Anthony Bourdain came to the country and featured you in one of his shows. It seemed like things were really opening up.
I think that they were to an extent. There was a great desire to woo foreign travelers, foreign investment. Some would say that in wooing them, Iran's plan was to capture some of them. But if you look at the numbers, it's a very small percentage that end up in situations like I did. But it was a moment of some hope for the future, of a more open future. And that was really what the Iranian people kind of staked their hopes in. So I think that my arrest, while very surprising for anybody who was watching Iran at the moment, can be understood in the context of the domestic spat that was going on at the time, and the goal of factions within the Iranian regime that don't want to see the Islamic Republic opening to the world. They were doing whatever they could to throw rocks at this deal-making that was going on between Tehran and Washington and Brussels, and taking a very high-profile American citizen working for a high-profile American news company seemed to make sense to them.
Yeah. So you knew that Iran had a fraught history with taking hostages. In some ways, this regime was founded on a hostage-taking. Yep. Did you worry?
Look, the hostage-taking in Iran obviously didn't start with me. It hasn't ended with my release. Since I got out, several Americans and nationals of other countries have been arrested before in these past 3 years. I have to say that knowing the history of journalists working in Iran and dual nationals, I had accepted the possibility that I might get arrested at some point. But I never expected that it would happen. And I don't think that there was any reason for me to expect that it would happen. I was working within the confines of the law and the parameters set for journalists. And a lot of times people think to themselves or say out loud that, okay, well, you were compromised because you were working within these rules of the state. Well, that's people's opinions, some people's. But the reality is that news organizations like the Washington Post, the New York Times, Associated Press, Bloomberg, CNN, and a whole host of others would rather have people on the ground reporting than have a big black hole in their coverage, even if there are parameters set. So I had become well attuned to what those were and how to operate within them.
But in hindsight, you do look back and talk about some red flags that were waving in the weeks leading up to
in the days and weeks leading up. I mean, there was certainly a sense that Yegi and I were being surveilled.
You were getting weird messages.
We were getting strange emails, and we were the targets of an email phishing scam. Right. Where you are sent an email, usually by an account that looks like somebody's account that you know. Maybe oftentimes a letter or a digit just missing or changed. With a link in there, and you click on the link, and the next thing you know, your entire contents of your system are accessible by the person on the other side. We didn't realize that happened.
The Democratic Party learned a little something about that in 2016.
You know a thing or two about this, yeah. So, it's sort of one of these things. People ask me also, well, didn't you take, kind of stringent cybersecurity precautions? In a country like Iran, where the internet is so highly controlled, so many of these things like a VPN don't actually work there. Right?
You must have just assumed a lot of your stuff was viewable by the authorities.
Always. Yeah. And I conducted myself in a very transparent way.
Okay, so let's go to the terrible day that changed everything for you. And in reading your detailed description of your arrest and the first day of your imprisonment, I was struck that traumatic events affect people very differently. Some people block them out. Others have really vivid memories of every single detail. You recounted that day in a lot of detail, and it was a terrible day. You were arrested at gunpoint. You had masked men take you and your wife up to your apartment. They ransacked the place. You were blindfolded, driven to one of the most notorious prisons in the world, separated from your wife, and told that you may well die in this place. That's a bad day.
It's about as bad as it's gotten for me. But I'll tell you, on that day, I still assumed that this would get worked out quickly, that the goal of these people that had taken us, and at that point we were unclear about which faction of the security apparatus had come and raided our home, that at some point their goal was to scare us and that this would end. We had heard about other correspondents and friends being harassed recently and over the years. People have been sequestered or detained for hours or a few days, and it usually passes. And my assumption was that with all of the things that were going on in the world, with the negotiations that were taking place between Tehran and Washington at a level that they hadn't been engaged in 30 years, that this would blow over. Someone would get involved and talk sense into the captors and say, this is not what we need at this time. I miscalculated there.
Yeah.
It went on a lot longer than anybody could have imagined.
And at some point, you switched from thinking hour by hour, day by day, this is all a mistake, it's going to end immediately, to realizing it's more than that. Was that the one of the low points?
Yeah, I mean, solitary confinement itself, and I spent 49 days in solitary. My wife spent 72 days in prison, all of them in solitary, is such an unnatural and jarring experience that you don't really take the time to think about how long this could happen, how long this could be prolonged, and how it could end. What you're thinking about is, how is this particular aspect of it, being confined in a tiny place, how long can they do this to me for? Mm-hmm. I know now that international conventions don't allow more than several days of people being confined in solitude. Unfortunately, many governments around the world, including our own, don't follow these conventions. They don't adhere to them, especially in cases that are deemed national security cases, right? Which is a catchphrase that I think, unfortunately, after September 11th, we have used in this country too often to justify the arrests of people who may have been up to nefarious acts, plotting terrorism, but also in some cases we know now were guilty of nothing more than having the wrong kind of name and coming from the wrong faith. So the rest of the world, Iran included, and we see it in Turkey, and we see it in Pakistan and Ethiopia and Egypt, and across the world, people are using these excuses now to hold people in solitary for long periods of time.
Your captors reminded you of Guantanamo frequently.
Often. And, at the time, I would ground them in the reality of the present. Say to them, I'm guessing that you've never been to Guantanamo, because if you had been, you'd probably still be there. And I've never been there either. And we're in Evin prison right now. And you claim to be, practitioners of Islamic justice. And everything that you're doing here runs counter to the rules and regulations of your sacred texts. So, you're going against God's will. Now, whether or not you and I, and we've discussed this before, believe in that higher power or not, my captors believed that they believed in one.
So that was a soft spot.
It was an Achilles heel for them, certainly. Yeah.
Let's talk about the way they treated you. 544 days is a long time to be imprisoned. One of the things that jumps out is it seems like there were some lines they really carefully did not cross. They did not physically mistreat or torture you, but the psychological mistreatment was endless. They lied to you, they threatened you, they played constant games with you. Talk a little bit about that.
I would say that physical mistreatment is a tough one to quantify. But physical violence and that sort of torture, no.
They didn't rough you up.
They did not rough me up. But they did everything they could to break me down mentally, starting with telling me that I would be executed, have my limbs cut off, beheaded, my wife as well. Oftentimes, they would tell us that we'd never see each other again. We had no idea of each other's whereabouts for the first 35 days. And that in itself was torturous, wondering what they might be doing to my wife. And, I write about this, and I don't go into great detail, but that prison has a history of raping inmates, male and female. It's pretty well documented. So I worried about her survival, her health, her well-being, but I also worried about whether or not we were ever going to get out of this place. And at certain points, they would tell me, you're going to be released tomorrow. Other times, they say, you're going to spend the rest of your life here. It's a constant manipulation. As time goes on, I was kept in cells the entire time where there were artificial, lighting 24 hours a day, right? I grew sensitive to light. In isolation, you become very, very sensitive to sound. I lived for a year and a half with no horizons. There was walls around me all the time. When I finally did get out, I couldn't sit in a car. I get car sick like a 6-year-old. So these were the effects that it had on me that were pretty easy to measure or identify during my time in prison and also in the months immediately following it. But after, it's the lingering effects. And I still don't feel 3 years after my release like the same person that was taken in. I can't put real words to it, but my chemistry, my brain chemistry, has been fundamentally altered.
By those deprivations. Yeah.
By the deprivations, by the manipulations, by the living under constant stress.
Talk about some of these manipulations specifically, the human interactions that you were allowed every day. Were mainly with one character who features very prominently in the book.
Yeah.
Your interrogator.
Yeah.
He, like, some days he would portray himself as your friend.
Right.
Others he would be your tormentor. But this guy named Kazem. And Kazem is a very compelling figure in your book. I can't wait to see the casting. If this becomes a movie, it's going to be difficult to cast Kazem. But he was full of crazy conspiracy theories. Each day he would claim that he knew some damning evidence about you and just tell you need to just fess up and admit it. My favorite was when he accused you of being part of a conspiracy to plan a Farsi translation of the Book of Mormon. But there were others. Tell us about Kazem and some of these crazy things.
So you have to understand, these are the best and brightest of a very ideologically formed youth. He wasn't dumb. Intellectually, he was a bright guy. He spoke pretty good English. And, you know, he was quick. But he had one very damning flaw that I think doesn't work in the collection of intelligence. He's unable to put himself in somebody else's shoes. And, you know, they formulate people to be ideologically pure, black and white. There's good and there's evil. So while that might be helpful to grow an army of religious sycophants to keep your regime or your system propped up, it doesn't help in terms of coming up with a narrative. And ultimately, their job was, more than anything, to take bits and pieces of information about me, some of it public, some of it that they gleaned from my emails and other messages, and come up with a narrative to fit the to fit the verdict that was decided before I was ever taken, right? So at once I was, as you said, you know, trying to bring the Book of Mormon, the religious text, not the musical, to Iran. I was trying to foment a feminist revolution. At one point, he asked me if I was Jewish, and you know, I knew exactly what he was trying to say with his funny accent. And I said, "What is that? I like a cup of coffee just like anybody else." And he said, "No. You know, a follower of the prophets Solomon and David." And I said, "Well, you know, I think, aren't we all, if we're people of the book, you know, because this is a common theme in Iran and Islamic countries that there's one God, and Jews, Christians, and Muslims share the same God, and we're all part of the same lineage." But I make light of this because it's what I could do to survive. Yeah. And as the accusations, the ridiculous accusations, mounted, and the hole that I was in was seemingly getting deeper and deeper, laughing about it and holding on to the prospect that someday you and I and me and many other people might sit around and talk about this as a story.
That helped get you
was
through.
The only thing that could get me through.
Yeah. I want to read a section of your book about Kazem, and it really struck me. It was literally your final minutes in Tehran. He had put you through so many head games and psychological traumas, but you also kind of got to know this guy, and it was a strange friendship. Here's what you write.
Relationship.
Relationship, thank you. Here's what you write. They took me through a side door to a ceremonial entryway. Kazem, Sayamek, and a few others were there. I looked at all of them one last time. I stared at Kazem for a long time until we both smiled. Then I did a crazy thing. I hugged him. Yes, it's even possible to develop an attachment to your tormentors. And no, asshole, that's not Stockholm Syndrome. That's called being human.
We can say that on C-SPAN? That's awesome.
I probably got bleeped out with that one.
Look, it was very important for me in telling this story, to be honest. You know, I could paint horns on these guys, and tell you that they were electrocuting me with cattle prods and hanging me by my wrists and, put me through mock executions and the like. And that wouldn't have been true, but many people would just accept it as fact. What I wanted to do was give you a human portrait of who and what I experienced, in the hopes that in reading this, those people who are so hell-bent on a regime change in that country might understand that as terrible as Kazem is, and as terrible as his worldview and his ideology is, I still think that there's a way to change these people. And on the flip side of that, those folks here in Washington and in Europe, and oftentimes in the community of Iranian dual nationals, whether they're American or British, Canadian, or European, who believe that, and not just dual nationals, other nationals who believe that any country that is standing up to American imperialism is on the right side of things. That's not true either. These are bad people doing bad things to innocent folks like myself. So what I'm hoping is that you walk away with this book, from this book, having a more complete understanding of America, of Iran, of the issues of being a journalist, of human nature and the world that we live in 2019, and ultimately just how much I love my wife.
Yeah, that comes through loud and clear. Let's talk a little bit about Yegi. I've had a chance to get to know you both. I'm not sure I know any two people more in love with each other than you, but your marriage was tested and strained by this experience.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, we were cut off from each other for those first 35 days, told many things about each other that we both knew not to be true, but, such a sustained period of time where people are trying to get you to turn on your spouse, I assume that sometimes it works. Mm-hmm. Didn't work for them, on us. When she was finally released after 72 nights, she became the advocate on the ground that anybody stuck in trouble in that country would want. When we look at other people who are in that same prison and their plights are being talked about in the news media, and we hear about what their spouses are doing or not doing, she always has an opinion about it because she was so effective in doing what she could to bolster my rights, which exist. But, if you're not able to access them, you're not going to access them. But she was able to figure these things out because she was relentless. But also to get bits and pieces of information out to the world. And as you know, through working on this for many months and contact with my brother, I also have a big brother who was relentless.
Right.
And a mom who was fearless enough to, at 72 years old, she's from Illinois, jump in a plane and come to Tehran and not be pushed around and said, my son hasn't done anything. I'm not going to leave until you let him go.
So I want to get to those heroic efforts from the outside to get you free and the role that each of the folks you just mentioned played. But before we go there, after Yegi was released, she continues living in Tehran. And for a period of time, you're kind of a high-profile public enemy number one within the country of Iran. I mean, your trial, such as it was sort of like the O.J. Simpson trial in America. And Yegi was your wife on the outside, seeing all that, being subject to all of the folks around her that were being fed this propaganda. Talk about that.
Look, I think she was so disappointed at how she was treated in those months after my release. Friends and relatives disappeared out of fear. People would say things to her. They recognized her in the street as the spy's wife. There was a case going on in the same courtroom as my case at the same time about a man who, during the Ahmadinejad years, had embezzled billions of dollars from the Iranian coffers, and his initials were BZ. And on the nightly news, they would refer to him as suspect BZ, right? When they would talk about his case to protect his
presumption of innocence.
Protect his presumption of innocence, and also to protect his family's privacy. Right? Okay. Everybody knew who this guy was. It was a big case. When they talk about me, moments later, it was Spy Rezaian, right? So this was what my wife had to deal with, and what my mom had to deal with, what my in-laws had to deal with. But what we understood, what we came to understand, was the more vociferous they were in their attacks on me, the reality was these were just responses to what was going on in the rest of the world.
All right, let's get to that, because
sure.
As the months go on, at some point you began to learn about this incredible effort spearheaded by your amazing big brother, Ali.
Yep.
And also the Washington Post, and your mom, who's the first one that came to my office, my congressional office, and got us involved in part of this effort. And of course, your employer, the Washington Post. When did you first learn about it, and what did it mean to you to know that there was this hashtag out there? I don't know if the cameras can pick this up, but these little lapel pins, Free Jason, and the hashtag and the global movement of journalists and others on your behalf really got rolling.
Initially, I found it hard to believe. But as time dragged on, I had, after I came out of solitary confinement, in my cell, a television that could access Iranian state channels. It's all it could access. And so that's a very warped view of the world. So I would see all of these reports about me and my guilt and how terrible I was. What I wouldn't see was what was going on in the rest of the world in support of me. But I did sometimes. They would show different reports, or they would cut to locations live when the foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, or when John Kerry or President Obama were giving speeches. So I caught little snippets, or I would see people I knew. At one point, there was a news report, and they were talking about the psychological warfare that the Americans were fighting against Iran by using these hostage cases, so-called hostage cases, to dampen the mood at the nuclear negotiations. And as they're talking about this, they flash some footage on the screen, and my brother is standing there next to a woman in hijab who I had no idea turned out it was a sister of Amir Hekmati, alongside the talk show host Montel Williams, who became a big supporter, an advocate, former serviceman who supported Amir as well. So I could see these things, and once or twice I saw Marty Barron, the executive editor of the Post, talking about me and demanding information and my release. But behind the scenes, there was so much more going on. Yeah. And I get into a lot of that in the book. It reads, I hope, rather seamlessly, but reconstructing what various people were doing at the Post, within my family, in the U.S. government, in Congress, Anthony Bourdain, who was also, a really staunch advocate for us from
Muhammad Ali.
Muhammad Ali. And then other little things. I mean, Edward Snowden at one point tweeted about me. Noam Chomsky and a whole slew of scholars wrote a letter demanding my release. At one point, one of the Kardashian sisters even tweeted, hashtag Free Jason. I think she thought I was Armenian.
And you still got released.
Exactly. It all worked out in the end. But it took this. I think you can probably speak to this as well. You've dealt with many different issues over the years. I think it's fair to say that it's pretty rare that so much momentum can get behind the idea of a single person.
It was a remarkable team working on your behalf, but you were just seeing these little pieces of it from inside the prison. eventually, as you began to have more regular visits with your wife and mom, they were able to fully brief you on what was going on. But it must have meant the world.
But they didn't know. They didn't know fully what was going on.
Well, that's true.
And so,
because they were in Iran.
It meant so much that people cared. What I wasn't sure about was, did my government care?
Uh-huh.
And it took months after my release to get the full story. And, I think I've chronicled it pretty well. I just hope people read it, because I think you can learn a lot about, what this government can do if an issue becomes important.
I want to come back to that,
Yeah.
but for now, take me back to one of the weirdest days in your book. We're leading up to a point where they're trying to get you to do a video confession.
Yep.
Really important to them to get you on tape giving some sort of confession.
Yep.
And they're always dangling privileges when they're not threatening to dismember and execute you. And one day, they take you shopping.
So in preparation of these, what I call completely optional forced confessions, they say, look, you've lost a lot of weight. And I had. When I was in solitary, in those 49 days, I'd lost 40 pounds. And they brought my clothes that I had been arrested in to me. I put them on, and even with the belt, I couldn't keep them up. I looked ridiculous. So they said, we need to take you out of the prison, and it's going to be a good test, right, to see if, we release you back into society. Does anybody, realize who you are or whatever? I just thought it was the most bizarre thing in the world. They threw me in the back of a car, blindfolded as usual, got me on a highway, took off the blindfold, and took me to a well-known men's clothing shop. And, Iranians have different ideas, or these Iranians have different ideas of taste in clothing than I do. So they were trying to get me to put on these kind of shiny suits. And I said, guys, if you want anybody to believe these confessions, you're going to have to put me in clothes that I would actually wear myself, because otherwise I'm just going to look ridiculous. So they let me pick out some clothes. It was so bizarre, because it's the same guys that arrested me in my house. The same team of people, were there throughout the imprisonment. The couple of times that I was taken to the hospital, the night that every time I was taken to court, the day that we were released, it was always the same group of guys. And half of them have surgical masks on, right?
But on this day, it's your concierge personal shoppers with you.
Right. And, a team of 8 or 9 guys, and people keep asking, what's the occasion, who's this foreign guy, all of this, because I have an accent when I speak Farsi. And they say, oh, he just got engaged, and, we're getting him some clothing so he can, go and take pictures with his fiance. It was the weirdest day of my life.
So you got a tailored suit of clothing, but it didn't stop there, because they then wanted you to buy some sweets and flowers.
Yeah, this was their attempt at sort of kind of trying to convince me that they were doing right by me. Said, you got to the lead boss of this whole operation says you need to bring some sweets and some flowers for your wife, because you've put her through this. I wanted to use a word that I definitely can't use on C-SPAN. But, I said, guys, this is crazy. This is ridiculous. I said, hey, look, you don't have a choice. Go and get some flowers. I said, all right, well, give me those tropical ones over there, the most expensive ones they got. I told them, I don't have any money. You guys have taken everything from me. They said, we'll put it on your bill. We'll add it to your tab. And so, we bought some pastries as well. At that point, I had a cellmate, and he and I were kind of starving, and I knew that bringing those back to the cell that night would be well-received booty, and it was.
So we're leading up now to your trial.
Yeah.
Tell us about this kangaroo court of a trial where you have this harsh, infamous judge that's been assigned to your case. You have strange interactions with him on the court days. There's not anything we would think of as actual evidence presented. There aren't any real specific charges, but you have these strange days where you're technically in trial,
right,
and then long gaps that follow. I want to read from page 196 of your book, where you describe what ultimately kind of came to constitute the charges against you, or the case against you. You write, but on the surface, this is what the case was all about. Take a guy who is, with some level of empathy toward Iran, describing in plain English the various elements of the Islamic Republic's ethos to an audience that for decades decided it did not want or could not understand it. It was too much for hardline ideologues to comprehend, which means it was impossible for them to accept. If you can't own it, control it, or understand it, you must destroy it. That was the attitude I found myself up against, and that essentially is what they were charging you with, right?
Yeah, I mean, they publicly, in the propaganda that they would produce, would say, he was sharing classified information directly with Obama. He had all this information about the nuclear program. He was advising the Iranian administration to accept a bad deal. All of this stuff that, had no grounding in truth whatsoever. But when it came time to come to court, they pulled out articles that I had written. And, I would go meticulous. And look, I'd been in prison for a year at that point. And I'd been interrogated about all of these things relentlessly for months. So when I got into the court, I had pretty well prepared answers for each one of these things that I was being accused of. First and foremost, by your own laws and your own reckoning, that's not a crime, right? I didn't break any rule. Second, it's ridiculous that you're accusing me of this sort of thing because I'm here in your country with complete permission. They had cameras set up at every one of my 4 court sessions. I think the intention was to have something that they could show on their propaganda channels. To my knowledge, not a single second of those 4 trial sessions has ever been released or put on Iranian television. Not in a raw form, not in a manipulated form. Because fortunately, my wife had convinced me. They were trying to get me to concede guilt. They would tell you, and in many countries when you're taken hostage like this, they'll tell you, hey, you just plead guilty. Mm-hmm. We need to show that to the world, and then tomorrow you get to go home. It doesn't always happen like that, but you and I have both seen instances when it has. But Yegi was adamant about the fact that you haven't done anything wrong, we haven't done anything wrong. And I don't want to be married to the guy for the rest of my life who, said that he was guilty when he wasn't. Right. And, she's a strong-willed woman and a smart one at that. So I'm really glad, in retrospect, that I handled it how I did. But it was scary.
I bet it was. Let's talk about what might have been the low point. I want to fast forward to Christmas time 2015. This was a month and a half or so before your release, or a month. The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is done.
Yeah.
The agreement is sealed. It seemed that your fate, at least at some point, was rather intertwined with this, but when the deal was done and you were not released, that had to be pretty scary.
It was more than scary. I fought the thought that I had been forgotten. I had all of this evidence explained to me by my mom and my wife to know that people were writing about me and people were talking about me. But I also knew that in international politics sometimes there are collateral victims. And I worried that I would be one of them. What I didn't know was that there were secret negotiations going on, and had been for over a year at that point, over my fate and the fate of other Americans being held in Iran. So as the year wound down and the JCPOA was set to be implemented, if you remember, the days leading up to Christmas, there was a presumption that it would be finalized and implemented in early January, but there was a lot of back and forth that had to happen.
It's actually called Implementation Day.
Implementation Day. It wasn't set to be January 16th. It ultimately ended up being January 16th because there was haggling going on about a variety of issues, including me. I couldn't have known that, and I didn't know that. I think the last 24 hours or so, which I don't want to talk about because I want people to read it, because I think it really is incredibly thrilling to see how all of these big geopolitical shifts that were happening at that moment affected our little life.
Let's not spoil the ending, but I find it fascinating that the Swiss played an underappreciated role in all of this. We don't have diplomatic relations with Iran, but the Swiss do, and so they could communicate officially with the regime, and they are also pretty good negotiators.
They're great negotiators. They were intermediaries in the negotiations of myself, Amir Hekmati, Saeed Abedini, and a couple of other Americans that were released but didn't travel with us that day. They provided a jet to fly us to safety, and it was
Swiss hospitality on the
incredible jet. Swiss hospitality in every conceivable way. And I consider several people from the Swiss Foreign Ministry to be, lifelong friends, almost like family to Yegi and I, because without their intervention and involvement, this might not have been possible.
Well, and from the outside, we were working with the Swiss regularly, and they were, in my opinion, heroes in this whole story. But they cut a better deal than even you knew they had cut. Even when you were being released, you were at the airport, were ready to go. I won't spoil all the details, but turns out they cut a deal that the Iranians, right up to the end, did not want to honor. Key pieces of it.
I think, it's important to note that the people that were negotiating this deal over my fate and the fate of the others were not the same people that had possession of me. Yeah. It's typical rug merchant stuff. Multi-part deal for a lot of different pieces of inventory, and a couple of them don't belong to you. And so there was a lot of jostling going on right up until the end. Kazem, who we meet early on in the story because he was my interrogator from day one, was there with me at the airport, as you say. He was unaware of the details of this deal, and I think probably very purposefully so. I think that they were being kept in the dark by their higher-ups about how this was actually to play out. And fortunately, the Swiss were committed and played this incredible intermediary role up until literally until we got on the plane and flew out of the country.
It was a minute-to-minute thing, and thankfully it ended the right way. It's not a happy story, but a happy ending for that part that came very close to not being so.
Well, and I bristle to think about how my life would be different right now if things didn't work out exactly how they had that night.
Let's go back to that dark period in December, January, when you're worried that maybe with the nuclear deal done, you might be forgotten. You had a chance to watch Barack Obama deliver the State of the Union address in your final days as a prisoner. And he didn't say a word about you or the Iranian prisoners, the other Americans. That must have been rather devastating.
It was scary, but at the same time, I came to understand that if something really was in the works, as I had been told, that it probably wouldn't get talked about in such a public forum. I didn't know that my brother was your guest that night at the State of the Union. You took Yegi and I as your guests the following year. And I think the State of the Union is so... The view of the State of the Union from the tens of millions of people watching it at home and me in my Iranian prison cell that day is very much focused on the President of the United States and one or two people that happen to be in the room. What people don't understand is what a representation it is of the country at the moment. Each member of Congress brings a guest that I imagine has something to do with what's going on in their district or an issue that's important to them personally, politically, professionally. And to know in retrospect that my brother was there with you changed my view of it. But on that day, I think it was January 11th or 12th, 2016, just before the speech was to be given, Iran captured an American Navy vessel, an armed vessel.
It had wandered off course.
Wandered off course into Iranian waters, mistakenly, but trespassing.
Yeah.
By our government's own admission, trespassing into Iranian waters. I was watching this unfold on television. My heart sank because I thought to myself, this is gonna just blow up any opportunity that I'm gonna get out. I might get 5 new cellmates, right? Yeah. American ones.
Right.
And within a matter of hours, it was resolved.
So this ended up being a hopeful event for you, because that told you things were maybe on a better track.
It was a hopeful event, but also one that said to me, why did I just spend the last 540 days in prison? If the U.S. Secretary of State and the Iranian Foreign Minister can avert this potential crisis, which at earlier points in the relationship might have ended up in a military confrontation, an armed U.S. vessel illegally in Iranian waters. I mean, just sound it out, right? But they were able to resolve it peacefully and quickly. It gave me an inclination that, okay, there are things possible here. Mountains can move. And a few short days later, they did.
Talk about your attempt to put your life back together, because it's not a Hollywood movie when you're released after this kind of an ordeal. You don't run down the tarmac from the airplane, hug your relatives, and everybody joyously moves on with their life. It's a little more complicated. It's a process.
Yeah.
I had a chance to meet you for the first time at Landstuhl Army Base in Germany as you were beginning that reentry process. But there were throngs of media from all over the world there with the bright lights wanting to talk with you. There were doctors from the U.S. government that wanted to assess your physical and mental health. Talk about the process.
It's an ongoing process that continues now. I'm thankful that I listened to the advice of the psychologists there at the base and my family to take a few days to really readjust to the notion of freedom. Freedom is the best gift and privilege anybody could ever hope for. But it takes some getting used to if you've been deprived of it for as long as I was. So having choice and agency back in my life, it didn't feel natural at first. I mean, I had gotten to a point where if I wanted to go to the bathroom for the last year and a half, I had to ask for permission. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what I could say no to. And I was skeptical of everything. I think I've retained some of that skepticism. Mm-hmm. The response, the public response from people here in the United States and around the world to my family and me has helped restore some of the faith that I think I lost in humanity. But I find it much harder to trust. I was someone who was a fairly intrepid traveler for most of my life. I don't want to go places that I'm unfamiliar with now. Mm-hmm. I hope to challenge that as the years go forward and get out and see the world again, because it was such an integral part of my life and my life experience.
But it's going to be tough.
It's going to be very tough, and it is tough. But I have tons to be thankful for, and I always try and focus my attention on what I do have rather than what we lost.
I was surprised that you named your book Prisoner, because you were really a hostage.
I like the term hostage better. I had some long conversations with my editor about that. I think that ultimately there had been a lot of books called Hostage. But initially, if you go back and you look at the releases that we made, press releases that we made when I first started working on the book, it was going to be called Hostage. But ultimately, the powers that be got involved, and they decided that this was a more appropriate title.
That's what it's like when you write a book and work with publishers.
Other people, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah. But you and I both know you were a hostage. Let's talk about being an American. This experience must have changed your sense of identity as an American, and maybe even your feelings towards your own country. You wrote a bit about that in the book. Talk about how you feel about being an American.
Look, I consider myself first and foremost a human, and right alongside that, American. We can be, as Americans, hyphenated in any way we want, and that's not a right or a privilege that's afforded to the people of most countries in the world, including Iran. So I take that privilege really seriously, and more so now than I did before. But I always appreciated and honored the moniker and the freedom that our blue passport allowed us to explore the world with. Unfortunately, I think in recent years, and I'm not going to just say over the last 2 years. I mean, I think this has been going on for a couple of decades now. That moral authority that we were known for throughout much of the 20th century has really come under deep question. I hope that it's not completely eroded, but I'd like us to get back to that. And I'd like to compel you and your colleagues right around the corner to do more, to work together, to protect the values that we can all agree on, because there's a bunch of them.
Protecting journalists is a huge part of that because of our traditional commitment to a free press.
And I think that we could talk about my colleague Jamal Khashoggi and his gruesome murder at the hands of the Saudi government. I applaud the efforts by the Congress to seek justice and demand justice in that case. Conversely, I'm very distraught and beyond disappointed and scared at the administration's non-response to this murder. And I think this trend of attacks on journalists have been amplified in the last couple of years, but they've been going on for a long time. We see it more often now in democracies than we ever have before. Right around the corner in Annapolis, 7 months ago.
Terrible mass shooting. Well, as your congressman, I'm proud of how you've used your platform.
Thank you.
As an author, as an advocate, to fight the fight for those values. I want to ask you one last question.
Please.
Because we're out of time. And I had like 2 hours of other material.
We'll do it again. If they want us to come back, I'd be happy to.
If you could, if Kazem was watching right now,
yeah,
what would you say to him?
He probably is watching, right? I mean, I think that these guys have a hard time letting go. And I think I would tell him, it's hard for you to do, but take yourself out of your shoes and put them in mine. Think about all that you did to me and that you've done to many other people in similar and in different circumstances. And know in your core that you're on the wrong side of history.
Thanks for a great conversation. Everybody watching this show needs to get out there and buy this book because it's fantastic. A fantastic book written by a fantastic person and friend. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you very much.
If you'd like to view other Afterwards programs online, simply go to our